In a world filled with bright lights and towering buildings, made of glass and steel, there was a city that never slept, a place where thousands of beings from many stars walked side by side, but never truly looked at one another, and in the middle of this endless crowd sat a girl alone on the stone steps of a great tower, her face hidden behind her hands, her shoulders shaking as silent tears fell, yet no one stopped to ask why she was weeping. The streets were full of noise, voices, and the sound of countless feet moving quickly to their own destinations, every creature busy with work, with trade, with pride, and yet in all that rushing life she remained invisible, just another shadow in a city that had no time for weakness. This was the reality of her world, a place where strength was honored, where emotions were a sign of shame, and where compassion had long been forgotten. Many passed by her that day. Tall beings with silver skin and proud crowns of bone on their heads glanced at her for only a moment before turning away. Traders with 4 arms carried heavy bags of shining crystals, muttering about profits and deals, and they did not even notice the child sitting in sorrow. Even those of her own kind walked past quickly, their faces stiff with cold indifference, because in this city, to stop and care was to invite mockery, to show weakness, to risk being seen as less. The girl cried, not only for her pain but because she knew no one would ask, no one would even care enough to speak the words that every heart secretly longed to hear. Why are you hurting? But then something different happened, something small yet powerful, something that would change everything. A traveler walked down the street, not tall and shining like the others, not covered in wealth or armed with strength, but ordinary in appearance, wrapped in simple clothes and carrying only a small pack. This traveler was human, one of the scattered people from a distant planet that many in the city often ignored or underestimated. Humans were seen as strange, too emotional, too curious, too stubborn, but no one could deny that they carried something different in their hearts. The human noticed the girl on the steps. The crowd moved fast around them, rushing forward like a river, but the human stopped. For a moment they simply looked, watching the small figure trembling alone, and instead of turning away like everyone else, the human walked closer. The girl did not see it first. Her tears blurred her vision, and she expected no one to come near. When she finally raised her head, she found the human standing just before her. Their eyes met. The girl froze, unsure of what would happen. Would the stranger mock her? Would they tell her to stop her tears and move on, like so many others had done in the past? But instead the human bent slightly, lowering their voice so that it carried no judgment, only a gentle tone of care, and asked the simplest question in the universe, a question no one else had dared to speak. Why are you crying? The words were like a spark in the dark. For a moment the girl did not know how to respond, because it had been so long since anyone had asked her something so kind. She tried to answer, but her voice broke, and fresh tears slid down her cheeks. The human did not turn away, did not sigh or leave, but simply waited with patience, as if the girl's pain was important enough to be heard. And in that waiting silence, she felt something stir inside her heart, something she thought had been lost-hope. All around them, the city moved on. No one cared about this small moment. Merchants shouted about their wares, guards marched with heavy boots, bright signs flashed with promises of wealth and progress, but in the middle of it all, on those cold stone steps, one human and one broken child created a pause in time. She saw in the human's face no mockery, no cold pride, only concern, and she realized with a deep ache that this stranger cared more than all the others who had passed her by. Her hands trembled as she wiped her eyes. She wanted to speak, yet the weight of her story pressed down on her chest. It was not only sadness she carried, but also fear, shame, and a terrible secret that no one else wanted to hear. She had learned to keep her grief hidden because every time she showed it, others turned away. But this human had stopped. This human had asked, And that was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, she was not completely alone. Human waited. Their eyes were steady, their posture calm, but inside their heart there was already a quiet determination forming, because humans had always been different. Where others ignored, humans asked. Where others turned away, humans stepped forward. This was their nature to care, even when it cost them, even when the rest of the world said it was foolish. The girl finally spoke, her voice soft and unsteady, whispering words that had long been buried inside her. She did not tell the whole truth, not yet, but she gave a glimpse, enough for the human to know that behind her tears was a story of loss and suffering greater than anyone else would believe. The human listened without interruption, their eyes never leaving hers, and with each word she spoke, she felt her burden grow lighter, as though the simple act of being heard was already healing her wounded soul. Yet beneath her fragile voice, there was a shadow, a tension that hinted at something more. The human could feel it. There was danger here, something powerful and dark, something that had stolen her joy and left her in tears. And as the last of her words faded into the noise of the city, the human knew one thing with certainty: this was not the end, but only the beginning, because when humanity saw someone weeping alone, they did not pass by. They stopped. They asked. They cared. And in that small act of courage, the seeds of a story that would shake the stars were planted. The girl sat quietly on the stone steps, her small hands twisted together as though holding onto a piece of strength she no longer had. The human stayed near, not rushing her, not forcing her to speak, but simply giving her the rare gift of patience. Around them, the city still moved like a storm of noise and light, yet for the girl it felt as if the world had gone silent, as if all that mattered now was the stranger who had stopped to care. For so long she had carried her grief alone, afraid to show weakness in a place where weakness was judged as shame. But now she saw in the human's eyes something she had never seen in others before, the promise that her voice mattered. At last, the words began to spill out. Her voice was thin and shaky, but once she started, she could not stop. She told the human that she had once lived in a small home on the edge of the city with her family, and though they had little wealth, they had warmth and laughter that filled her days with light. Her father worked long hours to provide food. Her mother sang softly to her at night, and her younger brother followed her everywhere with a smile. Life had been simple but safe, until the night everything changed. She described the sudden arrival of armored soldiers who served the ruling powers of the city. They came with orders, speaking of debts that could never be paid, of rules her family had somehow broken, though they never understood what they had done wrong. Her father argued, her mother begged, but no mercy was shown. The soldiers took them away, dragging her parents and her brother into the darkness while she screamed and clung to them. One of the soldiers pushed her down and told her she was not worth the trouble. She had remained behind, trembling in fear, while her family was carried off to a fate she could not see. Her tears flowed again as she remembered that night. Since then, she had wandered the streets alone, searching, hoping, but every door was closed to her, every plea ignored. When she asked questions, people turned away. When she begged for help, they told her to be silent. To cry in public was to show weakness, and weakness was despised. And so she had sat on those steps day after day, hoping anyone might care enough to notice her, but no one ever did. Until today, the human listened to every word, their face serious and steady, their heart heavy with the weight of her story. They had heard many tales of cruelty in their travels, but this one struck deeply, for it was not only a story of injustice, it was also a story of silence. An entire city had chosen to ignore her suffering, to let her sit in despair because compassion was seen as weakness. The human felt anger rise within, but they did not show it to her. Instead, They placed a hand gently on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment, reminding her she was not alone anymore. The girl looked up, her eyes red and tired, and whispered the question that had haunted her since the night her family was taken. Why did no one else care? Why did no one even ask me if I was all right? Her voice broke as she said the words, as though she could barely believe she was finally speaking them aloud. The human did not answer right away, for there was no simple answer to give. This was a world where people had forgotten how to care, and yet, within humanity, there still burned a fire that could not be put out, a fire of empathy, of courage, of standing beside those who had no strength left. At last, the human spoke, their voice calm but strong, telling her that sometimes others are too afraid to show kindness because they fear being judged, but that does not mean her pain is meaningless. They told her that she mattered, that her story mattered, and that no child should ever have to carry such a burden alone. The girl listened, her heart aching with every word, but also warming, because this stranger's voice carried something she had longed for, hope. Yet even as comfort touched her heart, the human's mind was working quickly, piecing together the fragments of her story. Soldiers had taken her family, claiming debts that could not be paid. That was not justice. It was control, perhaps even something darker. The human had seen such acts before in distant colonies, where powerful rulers used fear to keep the weak silent. If her family was alive, they were prisoners, slaves, or worse, and finding them would not be easy. Still, the human felt a pull deep inside, a choice forming like a weight in their chest. They could walk away, as everyone else had, or they could step forward into danger for the sake of this one child. And though they had only just met her, the decision was already made. The human looked at her and said softly but firmly that they would help her. The girl blinked in shock, unable to believe what she had heard. No one had ever offered her help before. She shook her head, telling the human it was too dangerous, that they would get in trouble, that no one could stand against the soldiers who had taken her family. But the human only smiled faintly and told her that danger had never stopped humanity before, that sometimes doing what is right is more important than staying safe. The girl felt her breath catch. For the first time since that terrible night, she felt the stirrings of courage inside her heart. She wanted to believe the human's words, though fear still clung to her. She asked them why they cared when no one else did, why they were willing to risk so much for a stranger. The human's answer was simple: because no one should have to weep alone while the world turns its back. Humanity does not walk away from tears. Their words echoed in her mind as she looked around the crowded city. The people still rushed past without a glance, yet she no longer felt invisible. Someone had seen her, someone had stopped, and someone had chosen to stand by her side. But in the shadows of the city, unseen eyes watched them. The soldiers who had taken her family were part of a larger power, and they did not look kindly on those who interfered. Whispers moved through the alleys, hints of danger already rising. The human and the girl did not yet know it, but their decision to stand together had already begun to set events in motion that could not be undone. Suspense grew like a storm on the horizon, and though they could not see its full shape yet, both felt the air grow heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The girl wiped her tears at last. She was still afraid, but the weight of despair was lighter now because she no longer carried it alone. She whispered her thanks, her voice trembling but filled with new strength, and the human nodded, silently promising that this was only the beginning. For in a city where no one cared, humanity had chosen to care, and that choice would soon test them both in ways neither could imagine. The human and the girl walked together through the streets of the shining city, and though the noise of trade and the glow of bright signs still filled the air, everything now felt different. The girl no longer walked with her head lowered in sorrow, for beside her was someone who had promised not to let her face the darkness alone. Yet deep in her chest fear still lingered, because she knew the power of those who had taken her family. They were not simple guards or common thieves, but soldiers who served the ruling order. Men and women wrapped in armor with the law on their side and cruelty in their hearts. To go against them was to invite destruction, and yet the human had chosen that path without hesitation. The human asked her to tell them more. They wanted every detail she could remember, for knowledge would be their only weapon against an enemy. So strong, slowly she shared what she recalled from that night. The soldiers had worn black armor with a crest shaped like a burning wheel, the mark of the Dominion Guard, the force that kept order in the city and across the worlds it controlled. She remembered the way they had spoken of debts her family owed, debts that had appeared suddenly, debts no one could ever repay. It was an excuse, she realized now, a way for the Dominion to take what it wanted under the cover of law. The human listened closely, their eyes narrowing with thought. They had seen the crest before on distant colonies, had heard whispers of the Dominion's cruelty. They knew the girl's family was likely not the first nor the last to suffer. This was bigger than one home, bigger than one city. It was a system, built on fear, and once fear ruled the heart of a people, compassion was forgotten. That was why no one had stopped for her, why the crowd had turned away from her tears. They were afraid to be punished themselves. As they walked, the girl noticed the stares they were receiving. Other citizens glanced their way with suspicion, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath. To them it seemed foolish that a human, one of the weakest among the stars, would waste time on a weeping child. A tall merchant passed and scoffed aloud, telling the human to leave her behind before the guard noticed. Another laughed, saying, pity had no place in the Dominion, that mercy was only for the weak. The girl lowered her head in shame at their words, but the human did not waver. They looked straight at the mockers and answered with calm strength, saying that if kindness was weakness, then humanity would rather be weak than cold. The girl felt a strange warmth in her heart at those words. No one had ever spoken like that. In this city, not out loud, not in defiance of the cruel order that ruled them. It frightened her, but also filled her with something new: pride. Perhaps she had not been wrong to trust this stranger after all. But shadows followed them. In the corners of the street, in the glass reflections of the tall towers, armored figures began to appear. The Dominion Guard had noticed the girl walking beside the human, and they did not like interference. 2 soldiers followed quietly, their visors glowing faintly red, their movements heavy with menace. The girl saw them and froze in fear, whispering to the human that they were being watched. The human only nodded and took her hand gently, leading her down a quieter street away from the crowd. Their steps quickened, and the girl's heart beat faster with every turn they took. They slipped through a narrow alley between tall, metal walls where the noise of the marketplace faded. The humans stopped, turning to face her with a steady gaze. They told her that the path ahead would be dangerous, and that once they chose it, there would be no turning back. The Dominion did not forgive, and if they interfered, they would be hunted. The girl trembled as the weight of the truth pressed down upon her, but she also remembered the long days of sitting alone, the endless hours of tears no one had cared about. She thought of her family's faces, of her brother's smile, of her mother's songs, and she realized she could not give up. With a voice soft but firm, she told the human that she was ready. She would not run from the truth anymore. The human placed a hand on her shoulder and promised they would find her family. Then, with determination burning in their heart, they explained their plan. They could not fight the Dominion head-on, for their power was too great. But every system of control had cracks. Every empire of fear had secrets. The human would start by seeking information, by finding where the taken families were kept. Somewhere in the city there were records, guarded files, or whispers in the lower streets that could lead them closer. They would need to move quietly, To listen, to follow the trail. The girl nodded, though her fear was heavy. She asked the human why they risked so much for her when the entire city was too afraid to act. The human's answer was simple, but filled with weight. They said that humanity had always carried one truth above all else, that life without compassion was empty. To walk past a child's tears was to lose one's soul, and humanity would never accept that fate. As they moved deeper into the city, suspense grew. The girl's eyes darted to every shadow, every corner, for she knew the guard would not let them act freely. She was right. Behind them the soldiers followed, more of them now, their armor glinting under the harsh light of the towers. The hunters had begun their chase, but the human was clever. They led the girl into the old sections of the city where the towers were broken and the streets narrow. Here the Dominion's presence was weaker, and the people were poorer, forgotten by the rulers above. In these dark alleys, whispers traveled faster than law, and the human knew how to listen. They stopped to speak with a ragged worker, trading a few coins for words, and from those words, they learned of secret transports that left the city each week carrying prisoners to a labor camp in the mountains. It was not proof, but it was a lead. The girl's heart twisted with both hope and terror. If her family was there, they were alive, but to reach them would mean facing the Dominion's full wrath. The human tightened their grip on her hand and told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to walk forward despite it. Humanity had carried that truth through wars and darkness, and they would carry it now. As night fell over the city, the human and the girl slipped through the shadows together, one small figure and one fragile child against an empire of cruelty. Above them, the towers glowed with false light, symbols of power that blinded the masses, but in the quiet streets below, something far brighter was being born, the light of courage, the fire of compassion, and the bond between a human and a child who refused to be forgotten. The storm of danger was gathering. The Dominion Guard would not rest, and the path ahead was filled with peril. But for the first time since her family had been taken, the girl did not feel hopeless. She was afraid, yes, but she was not alone. And that made all the difference, because when the world turned away, when the city chose silence, humanity stepped forward, carrying the weight of courage on their shoulders. And that courage was about to be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The night was heavy with silence as the human and the girl moved deeper into the forgotten districts of the city. The glowing towers of the Dominion still rose, high in the distance, their sharp lines shining like cold stars. But here among the broken alleys and cracked stone walls, the light did not reach. It was the place where the poor and the unwanted lived, the place where whispers carried truths that could never be spoken in the open. The human kept a steady pace, their eyes sharp, their hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder to keep her close. She followed, her small steps quick and nervous, her heart pounding with fear but also with hope, for each step carried her closer to answers about her family. They found an old worker hunched beside a fire, his face tired from years of labor, his clothes torn and stained. The human crouched beside him and offered food from their pack. At first the man laughed bitterly, saying food was a gift no one gave freely, but when the human insisted, he accepted with shaking hands. After eating, he spoke in a low whisper. He told them of the secret transports that left the city in the dark of night. He said the Dominion called them labor transfers, but everyone knew what they truly were. Entire families were taken and sent to camps in the mountains where they were forced to work until they broke. Few ever returned. The man described the path to the loading docks at the far end of the city, guarded heavily by soldiers with black armor and red eyes. The girl's breath caught as she listened. She asked the man if he had ever seen children among the prisoners. His face softened for a moment, and he nodded slowly. Yes, there were children, too many to count. Her heart tightened. with both dread and hope. Her brother could still be alive. Her parents could still be alive. But the thought of them trapped in such a place, suffering every day, filled her with pain so sharp she almost could not breathe. The human listened without fear in their eyes, though inside they felt the weight of the task before them. To face the Dominion guard at the docks was nearly impossible. Yet impossible was a word humanity had never accepted. They turned to the girl and told her they would go to the docks, they would find proof, and if her family was there, they would do whatever it took to bring them back. She wanted to believe, but she trembled as she asked what would happen if they were caught. The human's answer was quiet but strong. They said that sometimes standing for what is right is more important than surviving. The girl's heart shook at those words. She had grown up in a world where silence was survival and compassion was punished, but now she saw something new. She saw courage that burned brighter than fear, and it made her feel stronger even as she trembled. She nodded and whispered that she would not turn back, not now. Together they moved through the night toward the docks. The streets grew colder, the air thick with smoke from machines, the sound of metal chains clanging in the distance. The girl clung to the human side. As they approached the towering gates of the loading yard, tall fences covered in wires surrounded the area, and beyond them she could see the shadows of transports lined up like monsters waiting to swallow the helpless. Armored soldiers marched back and forth, their glowing eyes scanning every corner. It was a place of fear, a place designed to break hope. The human crouched with the girl behind a pile of crates and watched carefully. They studied the movement of the guards, the way the gates opened, the sound of alarms that echoed through the air. They knew rushing in would mean death, but there had to be another way. Their eyes fell on a group of prisoners being led toward the transports, chained together, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Among them were children. The girl gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth, for though she could not see clearly, she thought she recognized the way one small figure walked. Could it be her brother? Her eyes filled with tears, and she nearly stood, but the human pulled her back gently. They whispered that rushing forward now would only bring more pain. They had to wait, to watch, to learn. The girl wanted to scream, to cry out for her family, but she bit her lip hard and stayed still. Trusting the human, the soldiers shouted commands, pushing the prisoners into the transports. The sight burned into the girl's heart. She whispered that they had to do something. They could not just watch. The human agreed, but they explained that one act of recklessness would not save anyone. They would need a plan, and they would need courage stronger than the Dominion's cruelty. As they waited in the shadows, the human's mind raced. They would have to enter the camp, not just the docks. The transports would leave soon, and once the prisoners were gone, the city would forget them completely. That meant the journey would lead beyond the city, into the mountains where the Dominion ruled with even tighter chains. It would be a path of danger and sacrifice. The girl looked at the human, fear and hope mixing in her wide eyes, and asked if they truly meant to go that far. The human looked back at her with a calm, steady gaze, and said yes. Humanity had always walked into the fire when others ran, and this would be no different. The girl pressed her small hands to her face and wept again. But this time her tears were not of despair. They were of something deeper, something new. For the first time since her family had been taken, she believed they might still be saved. And for the first time, she believed in someone else enough to hope. But as they turned to leave the docks, the danger revealed itself. A soldier had noticed movement in the shadows. With a sharp cry, the alarm was raised. Lights flared across the yard, red beams cutting through the night, and armored figures rushed toward the crates where the human and the girl hid. The girl's heart nearly stopped in terror, but the human stood, pulling her close, their body shielding hers. They whispered that no matter what happened, she must keep moving forward, because hope was stronger than fear. The soldiers closed in, their weapons glowing, their voices harsh as they shouted commands. The human took a deep breath, their eyes steady, their voice calm as they told the girl to run when they gave the word. She clutched their arm, terrified of losing the only person who had ever cared for her, but the human only smiled gently and told her that courage was not about being unafraid. It was about choosing to act despite the fear. The night exploded with sound as the soldiers advanced, and in that moment, the girl realized the truth. The human was willing to stand against the impossible, to fight not for glory or power, but for her, a child the world had ignored. The darkness of the Dominion was strong, but she saw now that the light of humanity's heart was stronger still. The path ahead would be filled with danger, perhaps even death, but one thing was certain: they would not stop. Together they would face the storm, and no empire of cruelty could erase the courage that burned inside them. The alarms rang through the night like thunder, echoing off the steel walls of the loading yard. Red lights flashed across the dark sky as soldiers rushed forward, their armored boots striking the ground in rhythm like the beat of war drums. The girl's heart pounded with terror as she clung to the human's arm, her breath coming in short gasps. She had never been so close to the power of the Dominion before, and every instinct told her to hide, to beg for mercy, to give up before the storm swallowed her. Yet the human stood tall, their body shielding her, their eyes steady even as weapons were raised against them. The leader of the soldiers stepped forward, his voice harsh and metallic as he demanded that the human surrender. He called them a fool for protecting the child marked as worthless, a burden to the Dominion, a weak life not worth saving. His words cut like blades, meant to strike fear into the heart, but the human did not move. Instead they raised their voice, loud enough for all to hear, declaring that no life was worthless, that no child deserved to suffer alone, and that strength without compassion was not strength at all but weakness disguised as power. The soldiers laughed at such words, their voices filled with scorn, but the girl felt her chest tighten with something stronger than fear. It was pride. The human was standing against them all, speaking truths that no one else dared to speak. Even if the world mocked them, they refused to be silent. With a sudden motion, the human pulled the girl behind them and shouted for her to run. She hesitated, terrified of leaving them, but the urgency in their voice gave her no choice. She sprinted toward the shadows of the alley, her feet barely touching the ground as tears blurred her sight. Behind her, the sound of weapons filled the air, the clash of steel and the crack of energy bursts. The human fought with nothing but their strength, their wits, and their courage. They ducked beneath strikes, disarmed soldiers with quick movements, and used the darkness of the yard to their advantage. The girl looked back once, her heart breaking at the sight of the human standing against an army, but she kept running because she trusted them. The chase through the night carried her to the outer streets, and soon the human caught up with her, their breath heavy but their spirit unbroken. They had taken wounds, their arm cut and their side bruised, but they smiled at her with reassurance. She tried to speak, but words failed her, and only tears came. The human wiped them gently and told her they would not stop now, not when they were so close. Together they escaped the city under cover of darkness, leaving behind the glowing towers and entering the wild roads that led toward the mountains. The journey was harsh, the wind cold against their faces, and the path filled with danger as patrols searched for them, but the human never let her falter. They encouraged her with every step, reminding her that each mile brought them closer to her family. At last, after days of moving through forests and rocky paths, they reached the edge of the labor camp. It was a bleak place surrounded by fences of steel and wire, guarded by watchtowers where lights swept the ground like searching eyes. Inside the camp, the girl could see lines of prisoners moving under the weight of chains, their faces pale with exhaustion, their bodies thin and broken. Her breath caught as her eyes searched desperately, and then she saw them. Her father, his back bent but still alive. Her mother, her face weary but still standing. And her younger brother, thinner than before but still walking with his small head held high. The girl fell to her knees, sobbing with relief. They were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. The human knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder, their own eyes wet with emotion. But the hardest part still lay ahead. To reach them, they would have to enter the camp past guards and fences and the cruel order of the Dominion. Night fell, and the human waited for the right moment. When the lights swept away and the guards' attention shifted, they moved quickly with the girl through a gap in the fence they had cut with stolen tools. The ground was cold and rough beneath their hands as they crawled inside, every sound around them sharp with danger. The girl's heart hammered so loudly, she feared it would give them away. But the human whispered steady words of calm in her ear. They reached the line of prisoners, and in the shadows the girl finally touched her family's hands again. Her mother gasped and pulled her close, holding her as though she would never let go again. Her father's tired eyes filled with tears, and her brother clung to her, whispering her name with joy. It was a reunion filled with both love and sorrow. For they were still chained, still trapped, and freedom was yet to be won. The human worked quickly, using stolen keys and broken tools, to release the chains. The prisoners looked at the stranger with awe, for no one had ever dared to come for them. They whispered that the human was mad, that no one defied the Dominion and lived. But the human only answered that no one deserved to live in chains. One by one, the locks opened, and the sound of breaking chains carried through the night like music of hope, but the noise drew attention. The alarm rang again, louder than before, and soldiers stormed the yard. The human stood once more, their body between the prisoners and the advancing guards. The girl cried out, terrified they would fall, but the human turned back to her with a smile filled with warmth and courage, and said that no matter what happened, she must live free now because freedom was worth any cost. The fight was fierce, the soldiers closing in from all sides. The human moved with a strength that came not from power but from love, from the fire inside that refused to let the innocent suffer. They fought until their body could no longer stand, until their breath came in sharp gasps and their vision blurred. Yet even then, they held the line long enough for the prisoners to flee into the night, guided by the girl and her family. When dawn came, the camp was in chaos. The prisoners had vanished into the wild, and though the Dominion searched, they found only silence. Among the survivors hidden in the forest, the girl wept in her mother's arms, but this time her tears were not of despair. They were of gratitude, of love, of hope reborn. Her family was together again, and they were free because one human had cared enough to stop, to ask, to fight. She looked back toward the horizon where the towers of the Dominion city still stood, tall and cruel, and she thought of the human who had given everything for her. Her voice trembled as she whispered that she would never forget them, that she would carry their courage in her heart forever. She knew that in a world where no one else had stopped, where all others had turned away, humanity had shown a different path. Once she had wept alone while everyone passed her by. Now she knew she would never weep alone again. Humanity had taught her that compassion was stronger than cruelty, and that courage was greater than fear. And in her heart, she carried the light of that truth, a light that would spread to others, a light that no empire could ever extinguish. The end.